In the first half of the 1980s, the slasher subgenre came to dominate horror as quickly as it wore out its welcome. The byproduct of filmmakers trying to make a fast buck on a cheap budget with a proven formula that filled theaters. But just as it seemed as if slashers were about to fade away, one creator would leave his imprint on horror forever with a new vision of terror and a subconscious killer that became an icon. With a blend of suburban terror forged by John Carpenter's Halloween, a killer countdown crystallized by Sean S. Cunningham's Friday the 13th, and a fresh supernatural twist, Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger sent a shockwave through theaters. Craven's Nightmare not only brought a slasher resurgence, but became a runaway train that brought mega success to New Line Cinema before burning out as fast as possible in search of record profits. In this retrospective, we'll dig into the horrors behind the nightmare, the boom and bust of a franchise, and how Freddy Krueger became the rock star of horror, for better and for worse. Several years ago, I made a video on the many unmade Nightmare on Elm Street sequels that were considered but never filmed. While this video will briefly touch on the what-ifs of Freddy's films, watch that video for a more in-depth look at what might have happened. Consider it the B-side to this video's A-side. And now, let the nightmare begin.
Please, God.
This is God.
9 films, a spin-off show that turned its killer into a host, and a multimedia empire all started with Wes Craven looking to revitalize his flagging film career. In 1972, Craven almost reluctantly came onto the film scene with the controversial The Last House on the Left for Sean S. Cunningham, which Craven made with the intention of it barely being seen, and admitting to having never seen a horror movie before. But its wide release and backlash brought both attention and criticism to Craven, who had been raised in a strict Baptist household. Afterward, Craven would find further success with the raw The Hills Have Eyes, which was followed by the poorly received Deadly Blessing and Swamp Thing, as well as a contractually mandated Hills Have Eyes 2 that would sit on the shelf until 1984. Craven was never intent on being a horror-only film director, but he knew that the genre was what would let him keep making movies. And in search of the next idea, Craven took inspiration from several real-life incidents. The creator would cite the real-life story of a teenage boy who refused to sleep before suddenly dying in the midst of a nightmare, and a childhood memory of an elderly man staring into his window as the basis for a story about deadly dreams and a terrifying killer. As for the name of his villain, Fred Krueger was Craven's childhood bully, and already you can see the stew of adolescent fears that created the foundation of Craven's film. Pitching the script, however, wasn't easy. Friday the 13th in 1980 showed studios and independent filmmakers that a small budget and a high body count could rake in major profits. Afterward, dozens of slashers poured into theaters, able to capitalize on the craze with fast production schedules and little cost. The result was increasing controversy, censorship, and eventual audience burnout. By 1984, slashers were passé. Jason had had his final chapter, and even the Halloween series had killed off Michael Myers in favor of an anthology approach. It was in this changing ecosystem that Craven struggled to bring his vision to life. Craven began writing the film that would become A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1981, and was rejected by multiple studios throughout 1982. Disney wanted him to make it family-friendly. Paramount declined due to similarities with the in-production Dreamscape. Universal only wanted to distribute it, not finance it. Finally, it was New Line Cinema, founded by Bob Shaye in 1967, and only experienced in distributing films, that agreed to produce the movie on a budget of $700,000. But even then, New Line couldn't afford to make the film. In fact, the studio couldn't pay its cast and crew for 2 weeks of its production, forcing it to find several independent investors to support a budget that eventually wound up at $1.1 million, with the film mostly shot around the LA area, which is why the Venice Canals are in Ohio. Comparatively, that's a tiny budget even by small horror standards. That same year, Friday the 13th, the final chapter cost $2.6 million, and The Terminator cost $6.4 million. Still, Craven and crew had to make their elaborate and intoxicating dream terrors come to life on as little money as possible. But with sequences like Tina's ceiling death, which used a rotating room to push actress Amanda Weiss up the wall, and the film's general use of smoke and fog to create a dreamy alternate reality instead of completely new locations, the film's lack of budget isn't a limitation. Little things like stair steps that turn into mush, creeping figures, and random animals take an existing set or real-life location and make them surreal. The story, as I'm sure you know, revolves around teenager Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp, who encounters Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger, the spirit of a child killer now killing off her friends in their dreams. As Nancy tries to learn the truth about Krueger, really mostly referred to as Fred rather than Freddy here, she discovers a local cover-up. Krueger escaped justice, so the parents of Elm Street in Springwood, Ohio came together and burned him to death, hiding the murder. Now, Krueger has returned to kill the children of the people that killed him, including Nancy's estranged parents, the alcoholic Marge Thompson and Police Lieutenant Donald Thompson. And if there were never any sequels, Craven's film would stand as a major entry in the genre. But within the larger context of the franchise, it's even more unique. The original Nightmare is moody, strange, mysterious, and dreamlike, even when not actually in a dream, while visibly pushing the bounds of its limited budget. Not every actor is great or even good, and not every scare works, but the inventiveness on display is exciting. Freddy is more disturbing than iconic. Tina's death is a great psycho-esque swerve, and the slow reveal of the truth, while less impactful because of decades of the franchise being in pop culture, makes this a movie focused on the buried secrets of the suburbs and the sins of the parents coming to bear on their children. Every teenager here is part of a broken or neglectful home, usually ignored, discouraged, or given completely wrong advice. Nancy is truly on her own, trying to survive as the anxieties of the real world, adulthood, and growing up are crystallized in the film's gloved killer. Something like Nightmare on Elm Street, to me, was an examination of levels of consciousness and the pain of facing the truth, and how easy it is to fall asleep or want to fall asleep, said Craven. And only a few of us struggle to stay awake. Here, Englund's Krueger is menacing and cruel, but also extremely strange. Tina's death alone, which chooses to show the real-world effect of Freddy killing her instead of the dream scenario, is brutal, with her sudden slicing and slide up the wall disturbing in a way that sets the film apart from other slashers at the time. It's blood-drenched, but that's almost secondary to everything else that's happening. Also, shout out to John Saxon as Lieutenant Thompson. He's the best actor in the movie, and the way he both loves and denies Nancy is a very compelling dynamic. Nancy's mom's actress is not so great, but still, the struggle between parent and child is what this movie is all about. Friday the 13th was all about the freedom from parents, responsibility, and inhibition suddenly turned sour and punished. Nightmare is all about the buried secrets we choose to hide in our families, violently forcing their way to the surface. That alone is enough to make Nightmare on Elm Street an unforgettable horror vision. And when A Nightmare on Elm Street was released on November 9th, 1984, it was an immediate success, going on to gross more than $25 million domestically and $57 million total worldwide. As compared to the deluge of slashers that had overtaken cinemas in the past several years, Nightmare was much more warmly received by critics thanks to its inventive new approach to horror and themes of subconscious fears taking shape in a razor-gloved killer. In the aftermath, it was full steam ahead on more Freddy for New Line, which had gambled on the production and had its first true hit. Craven, however, wasn't interested in sequels after a difficult production that saw him constantly fighting with Bob Shaye. The original film's shock ending that saw Freddy still alive, terrorizing Nancy and her mother's terrible fake-looking doll, was a studio mandate to keep their potential horror icon in the mix for more movies. The Friday the 13th and Halloween movies had, after all, already proved the fiscal potential of taking a one-off idea and multiplying it into big returns. But whether Craven wanted a sequel or not didn't matter. New Line's purchase of Nightmare included franchise rights. So with Craven turning down a directing role after months of fighting with Shaye over profit participation, New Line rushed into the sequel.
Get out of here, Lisa!
Jesse, fight him!
Watch out for him. He'll be in your neighborhood soon.
1985's A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddys Revenge, directed by Jack Shoulder and written by David Chaskin, takes place 5 years after the original and focuses on Jesse Walsh, whose family has recently moved into the Thompsons' old home, unaware of its horrific past. Soon, Jesse's dreams are haunted by Freddy Krueger, who begins to use his body as a conduit into the real world to restart his murders. And here, Shoulder and Chaskin go completely off-book in regards to Freddy, his powers, and the general approach to Nightmare. But this movie looks a lot stranger in the context of the bigger franchise instead of just its own sequel, as the other movies forget this one and snap back to the dream approach and classic Freddy instead of this fire demon take. And of course, if you're at all familiar with the film, you know about the gay subtext. Well, pretty much just text, with Chaskin purposefully writing a story about a teen boy being confronted with his own sexuality and the internal struggles being manifested by Freddy. What's hilarious is that Scholder had no idea, and neither did the New Line executives, which is wild because this movie is so gay. Jesse visits a gay bar, finds comfort in the arms of another boy instead of his female love interest, and there's a general homoerotic undertone to everything. Jesse himself is a somewhat flamboyant alternate take on the final girl, the first real male scream queen in horror. And actor Mark Patton would later come out as gay. Your take on how well that's handled depends on your own personal outlook, but I think it's rather brave for a mainstream horror movie in the 80s. The movie is also super campy, brightly colored, filled with exaggerated characters and archetypes, and an absurdity that touches everything. That camp element, the metaphor, and the big fiery pool party confrontation, we're basically throwing away the dreams here, are the highlights of the movie, which still feels pretty bold. Not necessarily an amazing movie, but a really interesting one, and a horror movie that works a lot better when you just go with what it's trying to do instead of jamming it into the larger workings of the Nightmare franchise. And with a larger budget of $3 million, Freddy's Revenge would be a hit, making $30 million domestically and proving to New Line that they had a moneymaker on their hands, even if it wasn't as well received critically. The result would be a third entry focused on recapturing the essence of the original.
9, 10.
After 2 entries and mega popularity, other studio slashers began to morph into a supernatural take aiming to capture some of Freddy's popularity, and the result was a new wave of horror in the late 80s that owes a huge debt to Craven's creation. Even Nightmare's own crew ripped themselves off, with Craven's electrocuted Shocker and Englund's creepier Phantom of the Opera leveraging Nightmare's mainstream appeal for new movies outside the franchise. But even with the central premise starting to be diluted, Freddy would be solidified as an icon in 1987's Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, which saw Wes Craven return to the franchise with enough financial incentive, co-writing a screenplay with Bruce Wagner, and rewritten by Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont when Russell agreed to direct it. Russell and Darabont took Craven's initial darker idea of a new group of kids targeted by Freddy, with both Nancy and Lieutenant Thompson returning, and shaped it into a story centered on Kristen Parker, played by Patricia Arquette, institutionalized after nearly being killed by Krueger. And Dream Warriors very much plays like a classic approach to a sequel. Take the central focus of the original concept and expand it. More characters, bigger set pieces, crazier kills, and an expansion of the franchise's mythology. Russell also brings a glam rock and punk sensibility to the movie in its needle drops and aesthetic, with Dokken's Dream Warriors song being the crystallization. Once again, our focus is on a group of teenagers whose true experiences are denied and trivialized by society. This time a mental health institution, except for the returning Nancy, now an intern therapist, and a guy who I can assure you is not Bill Maher. And while Freddy's Revenge is known as the gay nightmare movie, there's a queerness to the film's central narrative of heroes rejected by society and finding their own people group, where they not only find their sense of belonging, but also become their true selves in the dream world. And Freddy, now much more of a jokester but still scary here, has become complete. He's still cruel, using each character's fears and desires to prey on them, torture them, and kill them in the dream world, giving more oomph to their deaths than just cheap thrills. Alongside these deaths are bigger set pieces. We're no longer in a hazy version of reality, but entirely new worlds that fit the 80s rock feel and become a staple of the series. A recurring theme throughout these films is absentee or neglectful parents of our teen protagonists. It's rare that a parent fully understands and trusts the teens in the film, which shows us how clearly these films targeted a younger audience. Except for being rated R, a juxtaposition that caused loads of controversy. And so often, these teenagers actually feel and look like teens, which makes their struggles more sympathetic and their deaths more tragic. Keeping that sympathy instead of making these characters into pure fodder for a killer is the key to the stronger movies in this franchise. While Dream Warriors had a slightly larger budget of $4.6 million, it made $48.4 million domestically, outpacing both 1 and 2 at the box office, and bucking the trend of lower profits that plagued most other franchises at the time. Just the year prior, Friday the 13th Part 6 would only make $19.4 million. It was clear that there was no stopping Freddy now. And Part 4 would look to hone in on what had worked so well with Dream Warriors.
How long has it been since you've been on Elm Street? Welcome to a brand new nightmare.
1988's The Dream Master, directed by Renny Harlin and written by Brian Helgeland and Ken and Jim Wheats, is the real turning point for this franchise. It's the true pivot into mainstream commerciality, the full leveraging of Freddy as a marketable icon, and New Line's prioritization of churning out sequels as fast as possible. Immediately following Dream Warrior's success, Shea wanted another ASAP. At first turning to Craven for an idea and then rejecting it. Instead, the company had Brian Helgeland write a script in 9 days and FedEx the draft so they could start work, with a polish by Ken and Jim Wheats. In fact, New Line was so desperate to get another movie out, they began shooting without a director, using second units for visual effects before hiring Renny Harlin. Production itself wasn't any easier, with the Writers Guild of America strike happening during most of filming. Shooting continued anyway, with Harlin and producers improvising dialogue and entire nightmare sequences. The result is an extremely visually inventive and stylish film, with Harlin pushing for Freddy to be the star and real draw for audiences. But every character and plot beat feels haphazard and poorly thought out. As far as reasons for Freddy being resurrected go, a dog pissing fire in a junkyard is the absolute dumbest. The slapdash production also meant that Dream Master works to be a direct follow-up to Warriors, but does those returning characters dirty, replacing Patricia Arquette, who didn't want to return, with Tuesday Night as Kristen, and killing off every returning character. These movies are about people, mostly young women, finding self-empowerment. And that's the case here too. It's just that the movie takes too long to get into its central premise, as the first act is mostly wiping the slate clean from Dream Warriors. The self-empowerment is maybe a little too literal here, as Alice takes on the dream powers and personality of everyone that Freddy kills. But having him use her to get to them is a little undercutting of her character. There could be something to the idea of Freddy being a victimizer, but that's not really what the movie is interested in. It's focused on extravagant death. Harland and collaborators like Screaming Mad George used every last drop of their budget designing the wildest sequences possible, and most are an imaginative feast, except for Rick's invisible karate death, the byproduct of there being no money left for a set piece. There's a lot of this movie that's just hurrying up to get to the next nightmare. That's cool and all, and this movie is super gnarly at points, but it doesn't do the story, themes, or characters any favors. By this point, the creators knew what the audience wanted and are delivering the assumed promise. And obviously, it worked. The Dream Master would pay off New Line's focus on marketable franchisement, making $49.4 million domestically, the financial high point of the initial series. Alongside this would be the MTV-ification of Freddy Krueger, sometimes literally, with the Fat Boys' Are You Ready for Freddy about and starring the killer, with the music video featuring a Freddy rap. From Part 3 onward, Freddy would become more and more of a jokester, turning his elaborate kills into pranks, complete with lavish sets and constant costume changes. Freddy became the selling point of these movies, taking up more and more screen time and given a constantly expanding mythology that ate up more and more of each film's focus. Outside the big screen, Freddy became the host and occasional focus of the spin-off Freddy's Nightmares, which began in 1988 and ran for 2 seasons, with Bob Shea apparently abandoning all supervision of the show and letting its rotating crew run wild. If it made money, that's all that mattered. A Freddy Krueger hotline was launched, where people could call in to duel Freddy in a trivia challenge for the chance to win a role in a future movie. Ironically, New Line started aiming their child killer star at children. 1989 saw the first Elm Street video game, made by LJN and Rare, as well as the beginning of many Elm Street comic books. Freddy was minting money, and Shea and New Line, now hungry for more of the success they had been starved of for years, wanted all they could get. Freddy Mania was running wild, brother, and his seemingly unending appeal caused a rush to Part 5.
Freddy delivers. A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5.
1989's A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, directed by Stephen Hopkins and written by Leslie Boehm, is the moment New Line's dreams of Freddy-powered success came crashing down. And much like Forest production, New Line was pedal to the metal in making 5, using a rejected pitch from Boehm during Part 3's production and having constant script changes while filming. Dream Child was the first instance of the MPAA really getting on New Line's case, after being much more lax than they had with Friday the 13th. Still, this movie is absolutely disgusting at times. And with a continued focus on Alice, this time trying to stop Krueger from being reborn through her unborn child, the film brings a close to the Dream trilogy, and really the franchise in general. We are in the most excessive take yet. Every character is an extreme caricature. The set designs and camera work are going wild, and it's way more sexual. Visually, it's a darker and more gothic film, with Hopkins making every place seem like a haunted cathedral, and making the dream world into an endless spiral of grease-covered metal, much like he would with Predator 2 a few years later. And while that could work when executed right, it just kind of feels consistently unpleasant. Having each movie introduce a new means of what will truly kill Freddy this time, and then immediately walking back is wearing out its welcome. We're sort of at playground logic at this point. You know how it was. Playing pretend with a friend only for them to shout, "Nuh-uh, actually you didn't beat me," every time you played by the rules.
It's a boy!
The kills here are messed up, man. Freddy basically Tetsuo the Iron Man's a dude just to get him in a car crash. Greta's death will get me demonetized, but Mark's death is the cheesiest in the series. I think it highlights the issue with this movie and the series in general as it continues. The characters stop being characters. They're fodder for kills. It's nothing new for slashers, but the long and drawn out nightmare deaths create a greater cruelty and sadism. There are a lot of inventive ideas here, but I think largely the film's ambitions exceed its capabilities. The film ends on a fairly happy note, with the baby born safely and Freddy, sucked back into his mama's dream uterus. But New Line just has to have a last-second tease that Freddy's alive, because they figured these things would keep them in the black forever. They were wrong. It's clear that after 5 films in 6 years, Bob Shaye and New Line had milked their franchise dry, with the movie making only $22.1 million on a $8 million budget. While that's still stronger than contemporary Jason Takes Manhattan's $14.3 million, Freddy's days were numbered.
But now, it's a new beginning. The beginning of the end for Freddy.
After a brief hiatus that entertained several different ideas, 1991's Freddys Dead: The Final Nightmare, directed by Rachel Talalay and written by Michael DeLuca, marketed the true end of the Springwood slasher, with New Line, known as the house that Freddy built, now successful enough to move on to other franchises, having wrung the last of their money from the series. To mark the occasion, they even held a mock funeral at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. For Talalay, Freddys Dead was a big break, having worked on every previous Nightmare movie in various roles including producer. But no offense, after several movies that became more and more excessive in their badness, this is a new kind of bad. Boringly bland, even if it's trying to channel John Waters and Twin Peaks. Set 10 years in the future, nearly every child and teenager in Springwood has been killed by the returned Krueger, with one amnesiac survivor escaping, leading to Dr. Maggie Burroughs and several soon-to-die teens investigating, with Maggie eventually revealed to be Krueger's long-lost daughter. Really, Freddy's Dead has a lot of shared DNA with New Line's Jason Goes to Hell, which would come out 2 years later. A surprise relative, random demonic powers revealed to be the reason behind the killer's immortality, those little dream sperm are the worst thing ever, and a final kill that promises this dude's dead for real. But I just don't think this movie works at all. After 3 movies trying to build up Freddy's mythology, we just hand-wave it away and kill everyone off screen. There's no real motivation or mystery, no interesting characters. Even the nightmares are boring now. England, the draw of this entire series, has been officially turning into more and more of a grating parody, and here he has crossed the line into completely, officially bad. Yaphet Kotto does, however, beat Freddy with a bat. Should have ended the movie there. Instead, an extended 3D sequence and Freddy's explosion ends the movie in a whimper. New Line's gamble of promising the end of Freddy did work financially, bouncing back to $34.9 million. But if the nightmare was going to return, it needed its original dreamer back.
In a town where movies go over schedule and directors go over budget, something far more evil is out of control.
The second half of the 1980s was a strange time for Wes Craven. The success of Nightmare was countered by the release of The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 in 1985, which he was contractually obligated to make in 1983, only for the film to shut down production due to lack of money. The resulting film was disowned by Craven, but stands as a strange blot on his career. His next film saw Craven, who had never wanted to be a horror-only director, locked into the genre that made him famous. Deadly Friend in particular was a bomb. Craven slowly built his career back up afterward, with The People Under the Stairs in 1991 being his most successful and well-received of this run. It was in this era of creative frustration that Craven agreed to direct and write 1994's Wes Craven's New Nightmare, using an idea that Craven had originally pitched for Part 3, but only after Shea agreed to give him a retroactive financial cut of the Nightmare sequels and merchandise he'd previously been denied. Craven fully dives into meta-commentary on horror and the film industry, an approach he'd later turn into huge success with the Scream series. But here, New Nightmare stars Heather Langenkamp as herself, a moderately successful actress trying to escape the shadow of her role as Nancy and a dead franchise, with Langenkamp married to a special effects creator and dealing with a stalker just like real life. But soon, Heather and her family become haunted by Freddy Krueger, here revealed as the manifestation of a demon who was kept under control by the continued creation of Nightmare movies. New Nightmare is most famous for its self-reflexive commentary on the series, but there's several layers here. Craven is clearly frustrated by the cartoonish and non-frightening direction his creation went without him, and is working to make Freddy scary once again, with Englund wearing a costume in line with Craven's original vision, on screen much less, and focused on terrorizing Heather and her son, who are both pretty good here at selling a slow deterioration. But Craven is also illustrating the importance of horror, and its ability to help us address and understand our own fears. Without the Nightmare movies, Freddy is let loose in the real world.
Miss me?
The experience of going to a theater and seeing a movie with a lot of people is still part of the transformational power of the film, Craven would later say. That is a remarkable thing. If you scream and everyone else in the audience screams, you realize that your fears are not just within yourself, they're in other people as well, and that's strangely releasing. If the original Nightmare used a subconscious killer as a metaphor for teenage anxiety and desperation in an age of neglectful parents, then New Nightmare has shifted its focus to adult anxieties, with Freddy encapsulating the fears of parenthood, careers, and grief. When seen in the context of the series, New Nightmare is a humongous whiplash from the extremely silly and cartoonish gore of 5 and 6. This film is very low-key and restrained for so much of its runtime, focusing on Langenkamp's family drama and mounting pressures instead of outrageous kills. Freddy himself, turned into a more serious version, barely makes an appearance in the first half, but the second half, with the line between fiction and reality disappearing, is really compelling. It's clear that Craven was interrogating himself and his horror career, clearly hoping to escape the genre but unable to find success outside of it. There are weak points to New Nightmare, mostly in that the film doesn't go quite far enough in its meta-commentary, but its adult fears work much better. New Nightmare would only make $19.8 million on its $8 million budget despite its much better reception from critics and fans. But Craven's reinvention and self-reflexive commentary serves as the epilogue to 10 years of nightmares, giving the series a happy ending, and also illustrating how much horror had changed in the decades since Freddy hit the scene. Slashers had died by the end of the 80s, and the early 90s are really not that great for horror, with studios either moving toward the prestige of thrillers that deny the horror label, or franchises that peter out as viewers lose interest. It was in this ecosystem that New Nightmare was released, and while it wasn't the hit that New Line or Craven were looking for, Wes would soon find mega-stardom with Scream in 1996, combining his dark meta-comedy leanings with Kevin Williamson's modern teen-focused script. Scream would absolutely revolutionize horror once again in the way the original Nightmare had, leading to the new wave of slashers in the late 90s, this time with a focus on teen drama, recognizable stars, and self-awareness. But the new era left Freddy even further behind, and the only pre-existing slasher franchise that attempted to reinvent for this new wave was Halloween, with H2O bearing the fingerprints of Williamson, and a style light years removed from the gothic and messy Curse of Michael Myers just a few years before. Freddy was truly dead, save for a long simmering hope to cross him over with Jason Voorhees in a movie that had been put on the back burner since 1987, with New Line purchasing the rights to Jason to make the movie happen, but pausing it in favor of Craven's return for New Nightmare and being acquired by Time Warner. Really, it was Sean S. Cunningham and the people behind Friday the 13th that were most desperate for the crossover, with the Camp Crystal Lake Killer never seeing the same box office returns as Freddy. Eventually, after years of pitched and written scripts that were rejected, these two titans would meet in the hopes of revitalizing interest that had disappeared for more than a decade.
Welcome to my nightmare.
I won't go too in-depth on Freddy vs. Jason as I've already discussed the film for my Friday the 13th retrospective. But it has to be said that director Ronnie Yu and screenwriters Damian Shannon and Mark Swift's Freddy vs. Jason in 2003 works much more as a Freddy vehicle than a Jason story. Freddy is the catalyst that is trying to achieve something and really given much more screen time than Jason, as he plunges both his fellow killer and victims into nightmares. He's also still portrayed by Robert Englund, as opposed to New Line swapping out Kane Hodder for Ken Kirzinger, showing New Line's esteem of Nightmare over Friday. And as far as the continuum of Scary Freddy versus Silly Freddy, the film manages to strike a decent balance between the two. This isn't the dark figure of New Nightmare, but it also isn't the campy jokester of Freddys Dead. Freddy's nightmares aren't that elaborate here, mostly returning to the scary industrial setting of early films, but with heavy color filters that firmly place the movie in the early 2000s. And of course, there's Freddy terrorizing Springwood and being pulled into the real world to be killed, with the killer somehow being tough enough to take on Jason. Pretty sure this dude got home alone by a teenager before. Where does this movie fit in the larger Elm Street continuity? Well, all you really need to know is that Freddy's dead, but he got better. But since Springwood isn't a barren wasteland, I'm not sure how Freddy's Dead really fits into this beyond just kinda happening in the past. All to say, Freddy vs. Jason was New Line's main event, costing $30 million to make, far more than any Nightmare or Friday movie, and making $116.6 million, way more than any grossed. After both franchises had essentially wrung the last drops from their material, the combination that had been teased since Jason Goes to Hell in 1993 had paid off. But New Line's inability to follow up with either property despite a proposed Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash sequel meant that Freddy was once again dead. But the nightmares can't be stopped forever.
Why are you screaming? I haven't even cut you yet.
The early 2000s had brought a lot of success to New Line, with the Lord of the Rings trilogy making $2.9 billion worldwide, and racking up 30 Academy Award nominations. The huge gamble had brought a level of prestige and success to the house that Freddy built that Elm Street never could. But after New Line's bid for another big Ring success and The Golden Compass became a gigantic bomb, Warner Brothers completely absorbed the studio they now owned, removing Bob Shaye from the company in 2008 and having it operate as a label instead of an independent studio. But there was still time for one last nightmare. Following Platinum Dune's success with rebooting Texas Chainsaw Massacre and in the midst of their work on the Friday the 13th reboot, Michael Bay and Brad Fuller worked with Warner Brothers to create their reboot of A Nightmare on Elm Street in 2010. Directed by Samuel Bayer and written by Wesley Strick and Eric Hesserer, the film revisits Craven's original story of Nancy Thompson and Krueger's revenge on the families that killed him, and oh boy is this movie terrible. Platinum Dunes clearly wanted a darker and more disturbing take on the material, with the movie explicitly making Freddy a child molester instead of only a child killer, which had been part of Craven's original story until they removed it. And I'm sorry, but everything this movie tries to do with Nancy and friends trying to remember their suppressed trauma is in extremely bad taste. This isn't resonant real-world horror. It's just a shallow, poorly done attempt to outdo the past for the sake of being taken seriously. Bayer also uses a ton of CGI in place of practical effects, but it's not good. It looks even worse when replicating the same gags from the original. In fact, everything looks worse in comparison to Craven's low-budget but passionate original creation. There's a focus here on the actual effects of lack of sleep on the body than any other Nightmare movie, but there's so much lacking here. And Jackie Earle Haley, a good idea on paper but weighed down by tons of inhibiting, realistic-looking makeup, is just bad. It's all just cruelty, with a much darker, more explicitly mean reinterpretation that has lost the spirit the franchise had even at its worst. Remaking the classic original was never going to be a good idea, but having so much of this movie be the exact same story but with all the inventiveness, style, and personality sucked out does no favors. Warner hoped their remake would bring new life to the dormant franchise and result in another string of hits. But while the Platinum Dunes version made $117.7 million on its $35 million budget, the reception was so bad they decided not to take another swing. I think it's telling that almost immediately after the remake hit theaters, Robert Englund's Freddy was back to being the de facto version, appearing at multiple Universal Halloween Horror Nights, showing up in Mortal Kombat, strangely looking like the remake but voiced by Englund, appearing in sitcom The Goldbergs, being DLC in Dead by Daylight, and generally being the iteration parodied and referenced in any other media. Of course, the general continued love for Freddy meant that New Line wanted to try again, with the studio announcing another reboot in 2015. The film didn't get far, quickly falling into development hell in favor of New Line's booming Conjuring series. Once again the subject of the studio churning out as many films as quickly as possible to squeeze money out of excited audiences before interest wanes. And in September 2019, the rights to Nightmare officially reverted to the estate of the late Wes Craven, who passed in 2015. Much like the ongoing legal battles surrounding Victor Miller and the Friday the 13th franchise, US copyright law allowed the original author of a work to regain the rights after 35 years. With New Line not having the same arguments as Sean S. Cunningham's claim to Jason, the reversal was swift and final. In the time since, Craven's estate has been actively taking pitches for a new Nightmare, with rumors surrounding TV shows, movies, reboots, recastings, and legacy sequels all floating around. But nothing official has been announced as of this video's publication. When will Freddy return? Who will play him? Will the franchise ever truly be able to thrive outside of Robert Englund's portrayal and Wes Craven's influence? I think that we're in the midst of a slasher revival, with both old and new properties playing off a resurgence of love for nostalgic, visceral horror. And Freddy Krueger's influence can be seen in the recent Stranger Things 4. It's clear that after an extremely fast cycle of boom and bust for the series, the time is right for Krueger to return. How he does is just a matter of time. But when you talk about Elm Street, you have to give time to the one consistent element, a true rarity for a horror franchise: Robert Englund as Freddy. When Craven first conceived of Krueger, he pictured his villain as an elderly man, which led the director to screen older men for the role. But finding they often had a softness and warmth to them that wasn't right for the character, he looked elsewhere, eventually finding Robert Englund, who was in his mid-30s at the time. Englund's youthful, energetic energy mixed with his burn prosthetics, razor glove, and malicious intent turned Freddy into a sadistic star. He just relished being evil, said Craven on his casting of Englund. And it brought out that wonderful thing about Freddy. It's the guy on the sidewalk frightening the kid. But he did it in almost a funny way. There's so much of the iconography of Krueger that's already in the original film, largely thanks to Englund developing the physicality of the character early on. While Craven's first movie typically obscures the villain in darkness, unlike so many of the later films, Krueger is instantly distinguishable from his slasher brethren, with Englund citing Klaus Kinski and James Cagney as inspiration for his movements. As the films became brighter and more cartoonish, so did Freddy, with Englund becoming more and more talkative like Bugs Bunny, and his voice deepening and almost becoming like a ring announcer. Not as scary, but more marketable. I think what's most telling about New Line's approach to the franchise is that when the time came for the first sequel, Shea refused to pay Englund's increased salary to return, and instead opted for a stand-in wearing a rubber mask. Thankfully, it was immediately clear how terrible that idea was, and New Line rehired Englund. If that hadn't happened, I really don't think these films would have continued. The franchise needs Freddy, and Freddy is Robert Englund. It's probably why there have been so few attempts to continue the franchise. And as I do with every retrospective, here's my ranking of every Nightmare on Elm Street film, from worst to best. At 9, A Nightmare on Elm Street, The the remake. This movie's a real bummer. Right from the opening minutes and its first graphic death, all alongside cinematography that looks like it was produced in a filthy old basement, it's clear that the Platinum Dunes approach to bringing Freddy into modern horror is to simply sap it of all life and personality. This movie has absolutely no energy, no style. It thinks that being gross, depressed, and lethargic are choices that will set it apart and make it mature. Instead, it just makes it boring, mean-spirited, and unnecessary. Compared to other contemporary remakes like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Friday the 13th, the Nightmare remake feels like the least necessary, adding nothing. In fact, it's subtracting. Why would anyone ever choose this over Craven's movie? No wonder the franchise died after this. Best kill goes to, no one. At 8, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Freddy's Dead tries to add a zaniness that creates an arch tone, leaning into camp, but it doesn't work. Add in a twist you can see coming, and there's nothing to pull you in here. This film has no flair, no style, and it all feels perfunctory, like checking off a list to finally put a failing series out of its misery. Characters just jump to conclusions as the devastated future Springwood is turned into a clown show. Even the nightmares are boring now, trading in 5's junky shocks for lazy silliness. Best kill goes to Freddy, stabbed by his own claw and blown up with a pipe bomb in the chest, making all those evil sperms shoot out of him. Mostly, I'm just relieved it's over. At 7, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. It's kinda wild how this movie, for all its ambitions, misses the mark so often and so hard. The kills are so gross, the effects are so wild, the tone is so insane, but there's nothing actually scary about Freddy, and there's nothing compelling about the characters. There's a central premise here that could be exciting, with Alice getting to meet her unborn son in their dreams and fighting to keep Freddy at bay, but nothing clicks. Relating to the fears of the characters and being forced to experience them is the true horror of the series, but here, they're just excuses for crazy kills. Also, he must have dreamed himself up, as the excuse for Freddy's return is the somehow Palpatine has returned of its time. Best kill goes to Dan, melded into his bike in a gnarly death that was forced to be severely edited down by the MPAA because it was insane. At 6, Freddy vs. Jason. I think it's telling that Freddy vs. Jason is much higher in my Elm Street ranking than my Friday ranking, and it's the true dividing line between the films I dislike and like on this list. The Slash of the Titans is fun in a dumb way, but its early 2000s aesthetic and tone ages faster than Freddy's 80s adventures. Still, if you're here for Freddy, you'll be more satisfied than Jason fans. Best kill goes to Trey, folded like laundry. Sorry, I know this is a Jason kill, but Freddy only kills one person in this movie. At 5, Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. Freddy was once the embodiment of the fears plaguing our heroes. Here, he's become the star of the show, and the result is a very different nightmare that is copying the formula of Dream Warriors, but boiling it down to its essentials. While I don't care for how the film treats Part 3's cathartic ending, it's still fun, and I think it's the high point for cinematography, effects, and imagination in the series, which makes up for where its story falls short. Best kill goes to Kristen, going from Beach Shark Freddy to a furnace. Not what I'd want for the character, but still a cool scene. At 4, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. A super campy, alternate take on Freddy that is one of the few Elm Streets to really focus in on compelling fears given life through its horror story. In this case, it's the story of Jesse's repressed sexuality literally coming out through Freddy, and both driving him toward and destroying the people he loves. A really interesting horror movie that works a lot better when you just go with what it's trying to do, instead of trying to make it work within the Nightmare franchise. Best kill goes to Grady, locked in his bedroom with Jesse as Freddy comes bursting out of his chest and stabbed through the door in the film's duel between attraction and repression. At 3, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. As the bigger, more expensive, more expansive return to the original Nightmare, Dream Warriors trades in some of the original scares and pacing for more fun and crazier set pieces. And as the third film in the franchise, and the one that really solidifies the formula for these movies going forward, Dream Warriors is probably the last of these movies with something on its mind until New Nightmare. This is maybe the most rewatchable of the entire franchise. To me, there's something that's just really fun and comforting about Dream Warriors' hair metal aesthetic that infuses the characters, dream scenarios, and music. It's got a lot of style. And of course, the title track rocks. Also, let's just come right out and say it. Not enough John Saxon in this movie. It needs like 50% more Saxon at least. And these movies would have benefited from keeping him around as the Loomis-like figure. Best kill goes to Jennifer, smashed into the TV in the moment that really crystallized the terror and comedy of Freddy forever. At 2, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. The big distinguishing point of this film is its meta-nature, focusing on Heather Langenkamp slowly becoming haunted by a demonic version of Freddy attempting to breach the real world. And with all its focus on studio politics, the pressures of fame, and the intersection of make-believe horrors and what really haunts us, Craven completely turns around the Nightmare franchise. But what really sets New Nightmare apart is how much it plays like an adult drama. I really enjoy New Nightmare, and after so many films that went beyond scraping the bottom of the barrel, this is how a story of nightmares, visions, and reality can be given new life. The older you get, the scarier and more cathartic this film becomes. Best kill goes to Julie, dragged up the wall by a now visible Krueger playing off Tina's death, and just as scary as the original. And at number 1, the original A Nightmare on Elm Street. There's no denying that A Nightmare on Elm Street is a total game changer in horror, taking the waning slasher boom and mixing it with a surreality that feels more like Don Coscarelli's Phantasm for an original beast of a horror film. When compared to many other contemporary slashers, the original Nightmare is more of a slow search for the truth, making this a movie focused on the buried secrets of families in the suburbs, and the sins of the parents falling on their children. That alone is enough to make Nightmare on Elm Street an unforgettable horror vision. Best kill goes to Tina, the first kill of this franchise and the one that will always stick with me. And in its focus on Tina's death in the real world, true terror was born. All these years later, after sequels, remakes, and a multimedia empire, the enduring appeal and terror of A Nightmare on Elm Street comes down to the genius of Wes Craven. Alongside Scream and The Hills Have Eyes, Craven changed horror forever, with a story that not only scared us, but excited us. It takes a rare talent to do that. And while Robert Englund as Freddy is known the world over, it's Craven who will always be the true Dream Master. Thanks for watching today's video, my latest retrospective and my return to videos on Nightmare on Elm Street. As I mentioned, I did a video on the unmade Nightmare sequels a few years ago, and since I've been digging more and more into these franchise retrospectives, I thought it was time to do one on Freddy. You might be able to tell from this video that I'm not the biggest Nightmare fan, but I am fascinated by the series. And there are several films that I genuinely, truly love in this series. And there are several films that I genuinely, truly love in this franchise. Obviously, the original Nightmare is a classic, New Nightmare is one that I continue to love more and more over time, and Dream Warriors is just a ton of fun. And also Freddys Revenge is a very sloppy and strange but compelling story. Digging into what works and what doesn't work in this series is really interesting to me because there's so many iterations so fast on the same film over and over in this franchise. New Line and Bob Shea were just slapping down these movies on the counter, again and again and again and again, and it made them a lot of money, I can't fault them that, but it really did drain this franchise really fast. I think you can see a lot of horror franchises learning a lesson from what happened to Nightmare, and also what happened to Friday the 13th. But I know that there are a lot of Fred heads out there, and Freddy Mania is still running wild in some areas, brother. But for me, I'll just take the good ones and forget about the bad ones, because I think some of these movies truly, truly stink. Obviously, I'm getting more and more into these retrospectives, and tons of horror retrospectives in particular, and I'm pretty sure the next one that I do will be a Predator retrospective. So hopefully, you're looking forward to that. In the meantime, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Nightmare on Elm Street. Both the franchise as a whole, the original movie, the character of Freddy Krueger, your favorite final girls in these films, your favorite nightmares, and also where you think these movies could have done better. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons for their continued support. If you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive audio reviews. But until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and trying to stay awake. Sweet dreams.